All of Philadelphia still says there are two things you should never wake: a winter storm and the anger of Rafe Costello, a man who, in 8 years of power, had never once needed to raise his voice, because his silence made people tremble more than any threat ever could. And yet one autumn morning, the entire city woke to a series of photographs exploding across every front page. June Costello, the boss's famously private wife, walking out of the hotel of America's most beloved movie star at 5 in the morning, hair undone, shoes in her hand. High society held its breath. The underworld prepared for a funeral, and the powerful families waited for blood as if it were a law of nature, because in that world, a man's honor can be washed clean in only one way. But Rafe Costello did not do what the whole city was waiting for. What he did in the 72 hours that followed belonged to no script and resembled nothing any boss had ever done, and to this day, people still tell the story as a warning: never try to predict the heart of a man who knows how to stay silent. And sometimes the truth needs one person willing to stand still in the middle of the storm before it can be seen. If you love stories of trust, reckoning, and comebacks that stop your heart, hit that like button and share this video to support the channel. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next unforgettable story. And now, let's step into the story. 48 hours before that fateful morning, the Costello mansion was still a quiet world, the kind of quiet that belonged to houses too large and marriages carrying too many things left unsaid. That evening's dinner had only 2 people sitting at opposite ends of the long table, just as it had been for the past 3 years. June sat with her back straight, her hands resting on the fabric of her dress, where she had hidden a small envelope folded in half, and her heart beat like the heart of a girl about to confess something for the very first time in her life. Inside that envelope was the result from the clinic, something she had read over and over throughout the afternoon until every word had become engraved in her mind, something that could change everything, or perhaps change nothing at all. She didn't know, and it was that uncertainty that frightened her the most. After 3 years as Rafe Costello's wife, she had learned to read her husband's silence the way people read the weather, knowing which quiet moments meant exhaustion and which ones meant a storm was being held back behind those gray eyes of his. But she had never learned how to cross the invisible wall standing between them. The wall that no one had built, yet no one had ever been brave enough to tear down. They were kind to each other, kind in a way that was almost painful. Rafe had never raised his voice at her, had never allowed her to go without anything she needed. But he had also never asked her if she was happy. And June remained in this marriage like someone carrying an unnamed debt, a debt that began 3 years earlier when she had agreed to marry the most powerful man in Philadelphia in exchange for the surgery that could save her only younger brother, and ended on a rainy afternoon when her brother never survived despite the money being fully paid, despite the fact that she had traded away her entire life. From that moment on, she lived in this mansion like a guest who was treated with kindness, playing the piano every evening in the room with the old instrument, and wondering whether the man sitting at the other end of the dining table ever looked at her and saw anything more than a clause in an old agreement. Tonight, she had planned to tell him. She had practiced her opening sentence dozens of times in front of the mirror, had reminded herself that no matter how he reacted, this baby deserved to have its father know about its existence. And just as she took a breath and opened her mouth to call her husband's name, the phone beside Rafe's plate lit up. He looked at the screen, and June saw what she had seen thousands of times before. The way that man's face closed itself like the door of a steel vault. Work was calling, and in Rafe Costello's world, work was something that was never allowed to wait. He stood up, adjusted the button of his suit jacket, and told her in a low and steady voice that she should keep eating, that he was sorry. Then he left the dining room with footsteps that were not rushed, but never once turned back. June remained there for a long while, her hand still resting over the envelope hidden in the fold of her dress, listening as her husband's shoes slowly faded across the marble floor. And she smiled to herself, the smile of someone who had grown used to standing behind the entire world in the heart of the person she lived with. Outside in the hallway, Rafe was finishing his phone call when he encountered Garrett waiting for him, the cousin who had served the Costello family since the days when his father was still alive. A man in his early 60s, with a smile that always appeared at the right moment, and hands that were always folded behind his back. Garrett reminded him in the gentle voice of a family member who carried responsibility for everything that he shouldn't forget the charity gala tomorrow night, that the entire city would be there, the press would be there, and this year the organizers had managed to invite the biggest movie star in America to serve as the face of the event. The occasion was important for the family's image, and the young master should bring his wife with him. Rafe nodded without slowing his steps, and Garrett remained standing in the hallway, watching the young man's back disappear, the caring smile still lingering on his face for several more seconds before finally fading away. In the dining room, a young maid entered to clear the table, moving with the same quiet and respectful manner as every other servant in the mansion, except for her eyes, which were slightly different. Her gaze lingered on June a little longer than necessary, paused on the envelope in her mistress's hand for just a moment too long, recording the timing and every small gesture the way someone records figures in a ledger, discreet enough that no one in the house had ever noticed, and no one had ever had a reason to notice. June never saw it. She stood up, returned to her private room, sat before the vanity, and opened the envelope to read it once again beneath the warm glow of the lamp. Those printed words she already knew by heart, the small life growing inside her, the child carrying half the blood of the man an entire city feared, and the other half of a girl who had once been an orphan, with nothing but an old piano and a younger brother. She pressed the paper against her chest for a moment, then opened the drawer of the vanity and placed it inside, closing it gently as if she were placing a promise somewhere safe. After tomorrow night, she told herself, after the gala, when everything was over, she would choose a quiet evening. She would pour him a glass of wine, and she would tell him. 48 hours remained before this entire city would wake up to photographs spread across every newspaper. But that night, June Costello went to sleep with one hand resting gently over her stomach and the sweetest secret of her life held close within her heart, never knowing that inside this very house, there were already eyes counting every step she took, and the trap waiting for her had been prepared long before she ever had the chance to dream about tomorrow. That night, the grand ballroom of the Bellamy Hotel shone like a day that had no sunset, and June stepped inside beside her husband, with the posture she had practiced for 3 years, her back straight, her chin slightly raised, her smile just enough to ensure that no one could read what was hidden behind it. Philadelphia's largest charity gala of the year gathered every face the newspapers longed to capture. Politicians, tycoons, women wearing fortunes around their necks, and at the center of every gaze was Beckett Lowe, the most beloved movie star in America, the man whose smile had once sold millions of tickets, and who tonight served as the representative face of the city's charity foundation. June wasn't particularly interested in any of it. She walked beside Rafe, feeling her husband's hand resting lightly against her back in the familiar gesture of courtesy. And inside her mind there was only one gentle thought repeating over and over, that once tonight was over, just one more night, she would finally tell him about the life growing inside her day by day. Rafe was pulled away almost immediately by handshakes and conversations that were half social and half business, the kind of conversations a man in his position could never refuse, and June did what she always did at every gathering. She stepped toward the edge of the crowd, standing near the grand piano, placed beside the stage, as though she were standing beside an old friend. It was there that the host found her, and before she had a chance to refuse, the name June Costello echoed through the microphone with an introduction saying that the wife of one of the city's most respected families had once been a pianist, and that it would be wonderful if she would accompany Beckett Lowe for a charity performance. The applause pushed her toward the stage. June looked toward her husband and saw Rafe give a small nod from a distance, and she sat down before the piano keys with a strange feeling that, for the first time in years, the entire room was looking at her as herself, not as the woman wearing a ring on her finger. She played better than she expected. Beckett Lowe sang beside her with professional elegance, occasionally turning toward her with the kind of smile only a star paid to smile could give. And when the song ended, the applause lasted so long that June had to bow twice. She left the stage with her cheeks warm and her heart feeling lighter than air. And at that exact moment, a server brought her a glass of water on a silver tray, saying that the organizers had sent it for the lady of the house because playing under the hot stage lights must have been exhausting. June thanked him and drank almost the entire glass naturally, without the slightest suspicion, because inside a ballroom filled with hundreds of elegant people, beneath bright lights and surrounded by music, no one would ever think to question a simple glass of water. The minutes that followed were when the world began to drift away. At first, it was only a slight numbness in both her cheeks. Then the music seemed to stretch as if someone had pulled it apart. The faces around her slowly blurred into moving streaks of color, and June held onto the edge of a nearby table, trying to find her husband's figure among the crowd spinning around her. But the crowd was too large. too bright, too far away. She heard herself say that she felt a little dizzy, though the voice sounded like someone else's voice echoing through a wall of water. And immediately an arm caught her by the elbow, a man wearing the uniform of the event staff, his voice calm and precise. "Madam, you need to rest for a moment. There is a private guest room upstairs. I'll take you there." June wanted to say no, wanted to say call my husband, but her tongue had already become heavy like stone, and her feet followed the stranger with a terrifying obedience, moving through the edge of the crowd that was absorbed in the auction, into a long hallway where the music slowly faded behind her, like a tide pulling back from the shore. Through the thickening fog covering her mind, there was still a very small part of June that remained awake, the part that had been trained through 20 years of sitting before piano keys, the part that didn't see the world only through her eyes but listened to the world through her ears. And that part, while her entire body went limp against the shoulder of the person leading her away, quietly captured two fragments of sound like a drowning person clutching onto two pieces of floating wood. The first fragment was a sentence that reached her ear when the elevator doors opened nearby, a deep male voice she had never heard before saying to someone, "Take June to the last room. Be gentle." And what made that memory sink into her mind was not the meaning of the words, but the way her name was spoken, bare and unguarded, without the title of Madam, without the name Costello, familiar in a chilling way, as if that person had spoken her name many times before in rooms she had never known existed. The second fragment came later, when she had already been placed on an unfamiliar mattress, when the footsteps were slowly moving away toward the door. A soft whistle rose in the air, a slow and old melody, rising and falling gently like a lullaby from some distant country. The kind of tune someone only whistles when they are completely at ease, when they are certain everything has already fallen perfectly into place, and it gradually grew quieter, softer, following the footsteps disappearing farther down the hallway. June's musician's ears held tightly onto that melody, like they were holding onto a name she had not yet seen the face of, carrying it with her as she sank into darkness. And the final thing she registered from the outside world before the blackness completely covered her was the sound of the hotel room door closing, soft, precise, and final, like the sound of a trap snapping shut. The sound of knocking pulled June up from the bottom of a dreamless sleep, a sleep so thick and heavy like tar that she had never known anything like it in her entire life. And when she tried to open her eyes, the world appeared in broken pieces, a strange ceiling, a strange bedside lamp, a strange scent of room spray, everything belonging to a place she had never slept in before. The door opened before she could make a sound, and a man wearing a dark suit stepped inside with a sense of urgency so carefully rehearsed that it almost felt unnatural. He leaned close to her and whispered in a hurried voice, "Madam, the Costello family car is waiting downstairs. You have to leave before the master finds out what happened. Hurry, please." Those words fell into June's fog-covered mind like stones dropping into muddy water. She didn't understand what was happening. She couldn't remember why she was here, but 3 words cut straight through every layer of confusion and touched the deepest instinctive fear inside her. Before the master finds out, and her body reacted before her mind had the chance to ask a single question. She slowly sat up, realizing she was still wearing the evening gown from the night before, her hair completely undone, and the man had already picked up her high heels from the floor and pressed them into her hands, supporting her toward the door while repeating again and again, "Hurry, madam, this way, the car is waiting." The hotel hallway was completely empty beneath the golden light of dawn. The elevator descended in silence, and June stood inside, holding her shoes in her hands, her heart racing wildly, her mind holding on to only one thought. She had to get home. She had to return before something terrible happened, even though she still didn't understand what that terrible thing was. The elevator doors opened into the hotel lobby. The man gently pushed her back toward the large glass entrance and said, "The black car on the right, madam." June stepped through the revolving doors into the pale, early morning air, barefoot on the cold stone pavement, her tangled hair blowing in the morning wind, her shoes still clutched in her hand, and at that exact moment, camera flashes exploded from 3 different directions like an ambush. Not one camera, not 2, but an entire line of lenses that had chosen their positions long before, the sharp clicking sounds coming one after another like hail striking a metal roof, figures rushing toward her with microphones and questions thrown directly at her face. "Mrs. Costello, were you in Beckett Lowe's room all night? Does your husband know what happened, madam? And June stood frozen in the middle of that storm of light for 3 seconds that felt as long as 3 years. 3 seconds long enough for hundreds of photographs to be created, before instinct forced her to run toward the waiting black car with its door already open. The car door slammed shut, cutting off the noise outside behind the glass. The vehicle began moving, and it was only inside that sudden silence that the remaining effects of the drug inside June's body were burned away by pure terror. Her mind slowly awakened piece by piece, like lights being turned on one after another inside a dark house, and she began putting everything together. She connected the glass of water on the silver tray with the dizziness that had struck only minutes later, connected the event staff member with the hallway that became emptier and emptier, connected the voice that called her name without any title or respect with the unfamiliar mattress and the sound of the closing door, connected the dark-suited man this morning with the words saying the Costello family car was waiting, and when she looked around the vehicle she was sitting in, she realized it wasn't a Costello family car. The driver wasn't someone from the mansion. Everything was nothing more than a rented vehicle arranged in exactly the right place to complete the final photograph of the performance. The guilty wife getting into a car to escape at 5 o'clock in the morning. There was nothing accidental about any of this. Someone had arranged every scene, precisely down to every minute, from the glass of water to the camera angles, and June sat there in the back seat of that unfamiliar car, both hands instinctively wrapping around her stomach with a new awareness she hadn't yet learned how to understand, realizing with a cold and terrifying clarity that she had just been placed inside a sentence that had already been decided, a sentence requiring no courtroom, no evidence, only photographs, because in her husband's world, people were not judged by laws, they were judged by honor, and honor had no appeal. At that same hour, on another floor of the very same hotel, Beckett Lowe sat completely still on the edge of the sofa, where he had spent almost the entire night, his phone lighting up repeatedly with the first messages spreading like wildfire through dry grass. The face that had melted the hearts of millions of viewers now pale and drained of all color, and no one could say whether that whiteness came from guilt or fear. All anyone knew was that his thumb remained suspended above the screen, never pressing the button to call anyone. And inside the car moving through the streets of Philadelphia as the city slowly awakened, where newspaper stands were unloading stacks of fresh papers still carrying the scent of ink, papers that would soon display her face on the front page, June did the one thing the person behind this entire scheme never expected from a woman who had just been destroyed. The script had written her role as a panicked wife, who would run away, disappear for a few days, and make herself look even more guilty with every moment she hid. But June slowly straightened her back, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and spoke to the driver in a voice so calm that even she was surprised by it. "Take me to the Costello mansion. Take me straight home, right now," because she had lost too many things in her life to not understand that some things could never be protected by running away. And if fate had already prepared a trial for her, then she would walk into it through the front door, facing the only man whose judgment still mattered to her. The car stopped in front of the Costello mansion just as the sun began rising above the maple trees burning with the colors of autumn, and June stepped out with bare feet, her shoes still held in her hand, walking past the 2 guards at the gate who tried desperately not to look at her. Yet their eyes kept drifting toward her as if pulled by a magnet. The news had reached the house before she did, and she knew it the moment she stepped through the main doors, because the entire vast mansion was sinking into a silence that felt unnatural, the silence of a house holding its breath. The servants stood quietly near the doorways with their eyes lowered. No one greeted the lady of the house as they did every morning. No one dared to, and the sound of June's bare feet against the marble floor echoed clearly through that silence, like the footsteps of someone walking toward an execution. Rafe stood inside the study, his back facing the door, and in front of him was the oak desk, where someone had carefully arranged the morning newspapers in a perfect line. His wife's face appeared again and again across every front page, her hair disheveled, her shoes in her hand, her frightened expression beneath the explosion of camera flashes, along with the enormous headlines whose every word had been chosen to cut as deeply as possible. No one knew how long he had been standing there like that. All anyone knew was that since early morning, the phones throughout the entire organization had been burning non-stop, calls flooding in from every corner of the city, and everyone was waiting for one single command from the man standing with his back turned inside that study. June stopped at the doorway. She didn't ask permission, and she didn't sneak in quietly. She knocked twice on the already open door, and when Rafe turned around, the two of them looked at each other across the length of the room, across the newspapers lying between them like a field filled with hidden mines. There was no anger on Rafe's face for her to read. That was the most frightening thing of all. After 3 years of living beside him, she had learned that the more dangerous this man became, the calmer he appeared, and that morning his face was as still as a frozen lake, his gray eyes staring at her without blinking, a gaze that neither accused nor forgave, only waited. She knew the entire world was expecting her to fall to her knees, crying, expecting her to swear innocence, expecting her to tell a long story filled with tears, because that was what women were expected to do in situations like this, and any tears she shed now would be interpreted as guilt. June did not kneel. She stood straight in the doorway, both bare feet firmly touching the cold stone floor, placed her shoes down beside her slowly like a soldier laying down a weapon before speaking, then lifted her eyes and looked directly at her husband. Her voice did not tremble. Every word fell clearly, one by one, like carefully played notes from a piano. I don't remember anything. I remember the glass of water. I remember feeling dizzy. I remember someone helping me walk away. And then there is nothing until someone woke me up and pushed me in front of those cameras. I know what this looks like. I know every piece of evidence is against me, and I have nothing in my hands except my own words. You may not believe me. She paused for a moment, and within that pause was 8 years of an empire's power pressing down on the shoulders of a woman who stood there with nothing. But she continued, "But I'm asking you for one thing. Don't decide today." The room fell into complete silence. Outside in the hallway, the servants held their breath behind the doors, and somewhere inside the mansion, Garrett stood waiting with his carefully memorized script, waiting for the roar of the wounded lion, waiting for the blood-soaked command that would set everything in motion. Rafe looked at his wife for a very long time. He looked at her bare feet against the stone floor, looked at the shoes placed neatly beside her, looked at the shoulders that never trembled even once, and inside the mind of the man an entire city believed had no heart. Something was being weighed. Not evidence, not photographs, but something much older than that. The memory of a young woman 3 years earlier who had signed a marriage agreement with a steady hand to save her younger brother, carrying that same straight posture, those same eyes that never begged. The person who created this morning's performance had calculated everything correctly about the crowd, the media, and the underground world. But they had made one mistake. They had designed those photographs to ignite an angry man. But Rafe Costello had spent his entire life learning one single rule: never make a decision while consumed by anger. He looked away from his wife, picked up the phone on the desk, and the entire mansion heard his voice through the open door, low, steady, and without a single ripple of emotion, as he sent orders down through the entire organization. Stand down. No one moves against anyone. No statements. No response to the press. No one lifts a finger until my next order. Anyone who acts without permission answers to me. That command traveled through the layers of Philadelphia's underground world within an hour, creating a reaction that no gunshot could ever create. The powerful families froze. Those who had already prepared candles for a funeral suddenly felt a chill run down their spines, because in their world, an explosion of rage was something they could understand, something they could predict. But the absolute silence of a man who had just been humiliated in front of an entire city was something no one could read, and anything that could not be read was terrifying. People began whispering that Costello had chosen to stand still, not because he was weak, but because he was seeing something that none of them had seen yet. And inside a room in the west wing of the mansion, Garrett stood by the window with the phone that had just delivered that news in his hand. His usual polite smile had disappeared, and for the first time in 6 years of laying his trap, the man felt a cold sensation move down his spine, because his script contained plans for every kind of anger in the world, but it contained no plan at all for a man who looked at evidence that seemed impossible to deny, and then ordered his entire empire to remain still. By noon, the messages of concern began pouring into the Costello mansion like condolence letters sent to the wrong address. The Marchetti family from the Harbor District sent a basket of wine with a handwritten note saying, "We are always standing beside you in this family matter. We hope you resolve it peacefully soon." The Doyle family from the northern side of the city sent an actual nephew to deliver a personal message that, "My uncle says the honor of one person in our world is the honor of the entire world." And old Abruzzo, the most seasoned and calculating of all their business partners, made only one short phone call with a single question dropped into the air like a blade being released. "Do we need to prepare anything for next week?" Not a single word in those messages mentioned the photographs. Not a single word spoke the truth directly, but Rafe read them the way a man reads a contract written in invisible ink. They were all demanding the same thing: a public price to be paid, a display loud enough for the entire city to see that order still remained, that the man at the top still knew how to do what a man at the top was supposed to do. And that debt of honor, according to the unwritten laws of this world, could only be repaid with one kind of currency. Garrett chose that exact moment to enter the study with the expression of an uncle who had spent the night losing sleep from worry. He placed 2 more newly received messages on the desk, then stood beside the window and spoke in the deep, warm voice that had been poured into the ears of 3 generations of Costellos. "My boy, I've lived in this world 20 years longer than you have. I've watched empires larger than ours collapse, not because they lost a war, but because they forgave an insult. People don't need you to be right. They need you to be strong. Every hour you remain silent is another hour those people down there practice looking directly into the eyes of the Costello family without lowering their own. You don't have to listen to me, but listen to your father. If he were still alive, that gun would have been out of the drawer this morning." Rafe sat behind his desk, listening to every word without interruption, his fingers intertwined beneath his chin, and when Garrett finished speaking, he finally raised his eyes. His voice was slow and clear, like someone driving nails into wood one by one. "You're right about one thing. My father would have done that. And my father died at 56 years old with 3 bullets in his body. I intend to live longer than that, Uncle. Blood is the most expensive and the most foolish price anyone can pay. Whoever wants me to spill blood right now isn't protecting Costello honor. They're waiting for the Costello family to make a mistake." Garrett lowered his head obediently and withdrew with the polite smile already returning to his face, but the hand hidden behind his back had tightened into a fist that no one saw. Meanwhile, upstairs in the mansion, June lived through the first hours of a life suspended beneath a sentence. No one locked her away. No one spoke a harsh word to her, and that was exactly what created the perfect prison. The servants continued serving her meals and attending to her needs on schedule, their eyes never daring to meet hers. Her phone remained silent like a stone, because the people she once knew outside had already removed her number before the newspaper ink had even dried. And she walked through those enormous rooms like she was walking through a never-ending courtroom where everyone was a juror and no one was a lawyer. She refused to let herself cry. She sat before the vanity, opened the drawer, and looked at the envelope still lying exactly where she had left it, like a tiny seed sleeping in the middle of a battlefield. She closed the drawer gently, then did the only thing that remained within her control. She sat still, remembering, tracing every minute of the previous night inside her mind like someone searching for stones at the bottom of a river, because she understood that if there was any path leading her away from this sentence, that path would not be outside those walls, but hidden inside the shattered pieces of her own memory. And across the city, there was one man who did not wait for orders and had already left before lunchtime. Mal Quinn, the silver-haired guardian who had stood behind 3 generations of Costellos, the only man in the organization brave enough to speak directly to the boss, parked his old car 2 blocks away from the Bellamy Hotel and walked inside through the employee entrance, using an old but useful identity as a long-time event security worker. He didn't ask anyone about the photographs. He asked about the water. He found the event manager, requested the list of service staff from the gala night, and discovered the first thing that made his old eyes narrow. There was no employee on the payroll assigned to bring private water to guests on a silver tray. The area near the stage that night had been handled by an outside temporary staffing company, a contract signed through 3 layers of intermediaries, and the employee who had delivered the glass of water to Mrs. Costello, according to several servers who still remembered his face, had not come to collect his payment that morning. The phone number listed in the records was dead. The address in the file was a parking lot. A man who disappeared overnight was a man who had been paid to disappear, and Mal knew that, so he kept moving. He went to the hotel security room, held out his business card along with a thick envelope, and sat down in front of the wall of monitors, hoping to catch the performance through the very light that had recorded it. The security operator typed several commands, then typed them again, and finally turned toward him with a face that slowly lost its color. "Sir, the data from the 11th floor last night, from 11 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning, is gone. It wasn't damaged. It wasn't a system error. It was completely erased using an administrator account. Proper procedure, correct password, no forced entry, no breach. Mal Quinn sat silently before those black screens, feeling the familiar cold of 40 years in this business crawl along his spine, because he had just understood the thing he desperately hoped he had misunderstood. The person behind this performance was not standing outside the walls. The person was standing inside them. Someone with access. Someone with the password. Someone with authority. Someone who was still called family every night. The news about the erased camera data reached the Costello mansion before Mal Quinn could even make it back, and it traveled through the fastest path possible, because after escorting the silver-haired old man out, the Bellamy Hotel security operator, with trembling hands, reported the incident to his supervisor. The supervisor informed the hotel owner, and the hotel owner, a man who owed the Philadelphia underworld more favors than he owed any bank, immediately picked up the phone and called the person he believed needed to know the most. Not Rafe, but Garrett, the man who had handled the Costello family's outside relationships for years. By 7 o'clock that evening, a thin file was placed on Rafe's study desk by Garrett's own hand, with the expression of a man being forced to do the one thing he least wanted to do in this world. "My boy, I checked 3 times. I prayed I was wrong, but you need to see this yourself." Inside were 2 documents. The first was the Bellamy Hotel security system access log, clearly showing that the 11th floor data had been erased at 6:20 in the morning using a high-level administrator account, and that account, issued years earlier under the security agreement between the hotel and the Costello family, belonged to the person responsible for the family's security, Mal Quinn. The second was a bank statement showing that exactly 2 days before the gala night, Mal Quinn had withdrawn a large amount of money from his personal account in cash, an amount impossibly high for a bodyguard's salary, an amount almost identical to the price usually paid to those who were meant to disappear overnight. Rafe stared at those 2 documents for a very long time, and for the first time since that morning, something moved behind his emotionless expression, because any other name in the world could have appeared on those papers, and he would not have even blinked. Except this name. Mal Quinn was not an employee. Mal Quinn was the man who had stood behind his grandfather when the entire family did not even own a proper car. The man who had held him in his arms when he was still a newborn. The man who taught him how to tie his shoes. The man who taught him how to fire his first gun when he was 16 years old. And also the only man who dared to pull a gun away from his hand when he was 26, on the night his father was killed, and he wanted to burn the entire city in revenge. Mal had stood between him and the door and said, "If you want to shoot someone, shoot me first, because I promised your father I wouldn't let you die like a fool." A man like that did not betray, but Rafe had lived long enough in this world to understand that the sentence, "A man like that would never betray," was carved onto the graves of many powerful men before him, and Garrett, standing nearby with his voice lowered like the sound of a funeral bell, added only one more strike. "I'm not saying Uncle Mal betrayed you. I'm only asking this. Who in this house has the authority to erase cameras? Who knows the gala schedule down to every minute? Who has spent 40 years going wherever he wants without anyone questioning him? You can trust whoever you want, but you don't have the right to trust on behalf of an entire organization that is watching you." Mal Quinn returned to the mansion at 9 o'clock that night and was stopped by 4 men in the main hall. He did not resist. He did not ask for a reason. He only looked at the faces of the 4 younger men he had once trained himself, then walked ahead toward the study as if he were the one escorting them instead. The confrontation happened without a single raised voice. Rafe pushed the 2 documents across the desk. Mal glanced over them with the eyes of a man who had read too many death sentences in his lifetime, then lifted his gaze toward his young master. And what tightened something deep inside Rafe's chest was that there was not a trace of panic in those old eyes, not even the desperate urgency of someone falsely accused trying to defend himself. There was only a profound exhaustion and something resembling careful consideration, as if the old man were standing before a chessboard where every move carried a price, choosing the move that would cause the least damage, not for himself, but for everyone else. "Ask me," Rafe said, his voice lower than usual. "I'm giving you a chance no one else in this organization would receive. Explain." Mal Quinn remained silent for a long moment, his large, scarred hands resting quietly on his knees, and then he spoke only one sentence. Slowly, not with the voice of someone defending himself, but with the voice of someone setting a question before another person. "Ask yourself one thing. If I had betrayed you, I would not still be here. I've had 40 years to betray you, and 1,000 ways to disappear. The person who betrayed you would not withdraw money under his real name, young master. The sentence was not a defense. It was an arrow pointing toward a direction. But it was fired into a room already filled with too much smoke. And Rafe, standing between the pressure of the families, the photographs, Garrett's careful whispers, and his own principles, did the only thing a commander who still had a clear mind could do. He did not accuse. He did not forgive. He said, "Go to your room. Stay there. No phone, no visitors, until I find the truth. If you're innocent, I'll open that door myself and apologize to you. If you're not, then those 40 years will be repaid all at once." Mal stood up, nodded as if receiving an ordinary work order, and when 2 men escorted him through the door, following the exact procedure that Mal himself had written for this organization, they searched him. His wallet, keys, phone, everything was placed into a tray, and from the inside pocket of his jacket, a small business card with worn edges fell out. It carried the name of a private investigation office located in the old southern district of the city, the kind of small office that did not even have an advertisement page, the kind of place only people who needed absolute secrecy ever searched for. No one in that room, including Rafe, understood what that business card meant. Only Garrett, standing in the corner, narrowed his eyes for a fraction of a second, like an old fox that had just caught the scent of something in the wind that was never part of its calculations. That night, the Costello mansion did not sleep, and inside the room with the old piano at the end of the second-floor hallway, June sat down before the keys, for the first time since the gala night, not to play music, but to do the one thing she had told herself throughout the afternoon she had to do: search through the bottom of the river of memory, feeling for every stone with the only instrument fate had left her. People often believed memories lived in the eyes, but June knew a different truth, a truth only those who had spent their entire lives living through sound could understand. Eyes could be deceived by darkness and drugs, but the ears of someone who had played piano since the age of 6 recorded everything even after their owner had collapsed, recording stubbornly, faithfully, without needing to be commanded. She closed her eyes, placed both hands over the piano keys without pressing down, and began walking backward into that night through the path of sound. The sound of the glass of water being placed on the silver tray, carrying the sharp resonance of thin metal. The music stretching and slowing as the drug began taking effect. The footsteps of the person guiding her through the carpeted hallway, short steps, even steps, faster than her heartbeat. Then the sound of the elevator doors opening with a 2-note electronic chime, and there, right there, the deep male voice had reached her ear, saying, "Take June to the last room. Be gentle." She replayed those words in her mind like someone tracing a string of beads, not to listen to the words themselves, but to listen to the voice behind them. And her ears, the same ears that could distinguish the difference between piano keys separated by only half a note, now revealed things that panic had hidden from her the night before. The voice was not young. It belonged to an older man. It was not hurried or worried, but calm in a way that was deeply frightening, the voice of someone standing on a stage he had built himself. And the way he spoke the name June, without any title or respect, was not the disrespect of an employee. It was the familiarity of someone who had mentioned her many times before, in many rooms, to many people, like speaking about a chess piece that had its own name. She held on to that detail, then continued forward, past the unfamiliar mattress, past the footsteps moving away, until she reached the final fragment, the whistle. It returned to her with a strange ease, as if it had been waiting just beneath the surface of the water for the past 2 days, a slow, old melody swaying like a hammock. And June opened her eyes. She pressed down on the first piano key, searching through each interval, correcting the wrong notes, finding the missing pieces, continuing until that entire melody took shape beneath her 10 fingers in the silent depths of the night. It was a wordless lullaby from some distant land, gentle enough to break the heart, and because of that, terrifying. Because what kind of person could calmly whistle a child's lullaby after burying a woman alive? She found paper and a pen, quickly writing 5 lines, and transcribed the entire melody with the careful handwriting of someone formally trained, every note, every duration, every downward slide at the end of each phrase like a sigh. When she finished, she folded the paper, and for the first time since stepping before the cameras that morning, June Costello felt that she was holding something that could be used as a weapon. During those same hours, at the other end of the mansion, Rafe was awake as well. The worn business card remained on the desk in front of him all evening like a riddle staring back without blinking, and after midnight, he sent 2 of his most discreet men to the address in the old southern district. Not to threaten, but to buy. Because he knew offices like that survived on two things: money and silence. And he had more than enough of both to exchange for the truth. Nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, a thick envelope was placed on the study desk. Inside was a copy of the entire file that the private investigation office had been preparing for a hidden client, and Rafe only needed to read until the 3rd page before the hand holding the papers lowered onto the desk. The client was Mal Quinn. The contract had been signed 4 days before the gala night, paid completely in cash, exactly matching the amount Mal had withdrawn that morning, the same amount people had presented as evidence of his betrayal. But the investigation was not aimed at Rafe, not aimed at the organization. It was aimed at a question. The old man had sensed someone was watching the schedule of Mrs. Costello, a new servant who often lingered near the kitchen while making late-night phone calls. A suspicious temporary staffing company that had entered the gala service contract through 3 layers of intermediaries. Things too small to bring to the boss without evidence, yet too suspicious for an old bloodhound to ignore. So Mal had paid from his own pocket, hired outsiders, and investigated in absolute secrecy. At the end of the file was a handwritten note, written in the careful style of a man who rarely held a pen, a note Mal had written only for himself, and one sentence made Rafe read it 3 times. "Do not reveal this inside the house. This person is inside the walls." And on the final page was a quick report from the investigation office sent to the client exactly at 6 o'clock yesterday morning. After the photographs had exploded across the city, it recorded Mal's final phone call, his rough old voice saying, "I just reviewed the backup footage from the 11th floor using my access rights. It shows Mrs. Costello being escorted away while completely unconscious. I'm deleting the hotel system copy now. Keep the backup I sent you safe, because if the young master sees that footage while his blood is boiling, he will kill someone tonight, and the person who truly deserves to die is still hiding. I would rather carry the name of a traitor than watch him lose everything because of his anger." Rafe remained motionless for a very long time before those pages, inside a room where the only sound was the pendulum clock, marking every passing second. The man who an entire city believed could never be shaken had to lift one hand and cover his eyes, because he had just realized that while the entire world around him was questioning the most innocent woman in his life, the man that same world had condemned had been standing alone, carrying the name of a traitor, simply to keep Rafe's hands clean of blood. And when the first pale light of dawn appeared, the guards in the East Wing witnessed a sight they would tell stories about for years afterward. Their master walked alone down the hallway, called no one, ordered no one, unlocked the door to the guarded room himself, stood straight before the silver-haired old man sitting on the edge of the bed, and lowered his head. On the second morning, while the entire country was still chewing over the photographs again and again, while morning shows competed to invite experts to comment on the scandal of the century, the main character in those photographs, movie star Beckett Lowe, received a message that made him collapse onto the edge of his hotel bed. The message did not come from the press, and it did not come from his management company, which had already called him 20 times an hour. It was slipped beneath his door on a plain white card with only one line printed on it: "Rooftop, 10 o'clock. Come alone." And instead of a signature, there was only a single letter: C. Beckett Lowe had played every kind of role during the 10 years he stood at the peak of fame, but no role had ever taught him how to walk into a meeting where he was 90% certain he would not walk back out. And when the rooftop elevator doors opened, he saw an empty rooftop garden that had been cleared of people long before, with only a small table placed beneath the autumn sky, 2 chairs, and the man that all of Philadelphia was afraid to call by his name sitting in one of them. There were no bodyguards anywhere in sight, and that was more frightening than an army. Rafe Costello did not stand up. He did not greet him. He only gestured for him to sit in the chair opposite him, and Beckett sat down, the knees of the man who had once played heroes saving the world trembling beneath expensive fabric. He waited for a gun, a threat, a punch, everything that movies had taught him to expect from men like this, but Rafe made only one movement. He placed a thick stack of neatly clipped papers on the table, gently pushed them toward him, and spoke in the voice of a man discussing the weather. $4,200,000. Meridian Club. 3 underground loans. 1 mortgage against your Malibu house that your management company doesn't know about. As of this morning, all of that debt belongs to me. I bought everything back. Every single paper. You no longer owe the people who had you trapped, Beckett. You owe me. There are moments when a person does not break because they are hurt, but because they are spared in a way that is almost terrifying. And Beckett Lowe broke exactly like that. The handsome face that had once appeared on 10-meter-tall posters twisted. His hands covered his head, and everything came out without a single question being asked. Messy, broken, and painfully honest. He told Rafe about the card games at Meridian Club that had started 3 years earlier, as nothing more than entertainment for a man with too much money, about the nights when losses were casually added to a tab, about the comfortable trap that slowly tightened until a month ago, when a stranger sat down beside him, not demanding money, but placing a phone on the table containing every debt record, every photograph, everything needed to bury his career in a single afternoon. Then the man told him there was a way to erase everything. He only had to play one role, the easiest role of his life, a role requiring no dialogue, only his presence. The script arrived through messages from an unknown number, detailed enough to be chilling. Accept the invitation to become the face of the gala. Ask the host to invite Mrs. Costello to accompany your song on the piano. Smile at her for the cameras. Someone else will handle the rest. And that night, Beckett swore, his voice hoarse, his eyes red as he looked directly into Rafe's eyes. That night, I never touched your wife, not even with one finger. They brought her into that room while she was unconscious and locked the door from the outside. And me, I sat on the sofa outside that suite's living room the entire night. I didn't dare sleep. I didn't dare call anyone. I didn't even dare go near the bedroom door. I sat there listening to her breathing through that door, and my hands were shaking like I was an addict, because that was the moment I finally understood what I had become part of. They didn't use me to have an affair with your wife. They used my face to execute her in front of the entire country. And I sat there until morning, hearing them wake her up, hearing her footsteps run into the hallway, hearing the entire world collapse through my phone screen. And I did nothing. I was a coward. Do whatever you want to me. But your wife is innocent. She is the only person in this entire performance who didn't know she was acting. The rooftop garden remained silent for a very long time afterward. Only the autumn wind moved through the carefully trimmed bushes, and Rafe sat motionless. Everything inside him that needed to break had already broken the night before when he read Mal's file. Now only the cold clarity of a man counting pieces on a chessboard remained. He asked briefly, "The person who gave you the phone, what did he look like?" Beckett shook his head helplessly. He wore a hat, sat in the shadows of the bar. His voice came through a mask. "I only kept one thing." Then he pulled out his phone and opened the chain of messages from the unknown number that had controlled the entire performance. Every order, every time marker, and the final message sent at 6 o'clock yesterday morning, containing only 2 words. "Good job." Rafe held that phone in his hand like he was holding the first loose thread emerging from the edge of a tightly woven piece of fabric. He did not confiscate it. He had his people copy everything and return the phone to Beckett. And then came the move that made the fallen star look up sharply, unable to believe what he was hearing. Rafe said, "You won't confess. You won't hold a press conference. You won't correct anything. You go back, lock the door, and let the media burn. And if that number messages you again, you answer obediently like a good debtor. Continue playing your role as if nothing happened. There is only one difference. From this moment forward, every message you receive, I receive at the same time. The person behind it thinks he is holding the strings controlling you. Let him keep believing that. The puppet has changed owners, and the person pulling the strings doesn't know it yet. That is the most powerful weapon in the world." Beckett Lowe left the rooftop with legs that were still trembling, but his spine had straightened halfway again. Rafe remained standing by the railing, looking down at the city below, screaming his wife's name, holding the copied message chain that his team had traced back to its source in less than an hour. The unknown number had been activated through a small shop, paid for with cash, but every message had been sent from cell towers surrounding the exact same repeated location, an old industrial area by the river, a place where every member of Philadelphia's underground world knew there was a steel door beneath an abandoned warehouse. And behind that steel door was Meridian Club, the largest underground gambling operation in the city. The very place that had fed Beckett Lowe's debt for 3 years like someone fattening a chicken before the day of slaughter. Meridian Club had survived for 15 years in the heart of Philadelphia, not because of the steel door beneath the basement, but because of an unwritten rule. The gambling house belonged to no single family, but it paid respect money to every family, and precisely because it belonged to everyone, no one ever bothered to look too closely at it. It was a stretch of murky water where every large fish came to swim, but none would ever admit the pond belonged to them. Rafe understood that so, on Monday afternoon, he did not send men to break down the door and storm inside like an invading army. He did things his way, quietly and precisely, like a needle sliding beneath the skin. 2 of his best men visited the casino's bookkeeper at his private apartment, bringing not guns, but a collection of photographs showing the man himself in situations his wife should never see, along with a simple offer: 1 hour with Meridian's real books, the kind that never appeared on tax records, in exchange for those photographs disappearing, and enough money for him to retire early in another state. The bookkeeper was a clever little rat who had sensed the wind changing ever since the Costello family's stand-down order had made the entire city hold its breath, and clever rats always abandoned a sinking ship before the water reached them. So by the middle of the afternoon, inside the mansion study, Rafe sat before 3 leather-bound ledgers and a small hard drive containing 15 years of Meridian Club's hidden bloodstream, and he began reading the language he understood better than anyone else in the city, the language of money. Money did not know how to lie. That was what his father had taught him when he was 18 years old. People could perform, documents could be forged, but money flowing through enough years would carve out its own riverbed, and the riverbed inside these 3 ledgers made the back of Rafe's neck grow colder with every page he turned. Because among thousands of loans, repayments, and chip exchanges from gamblers, there appeared an underground current flowing steadily for 6 years, large amounts of money entering the casino under the names of non-existent gamblers, imaginary people who obediently lost money on a regular schedule, and those losses were then transferred outward through shell companies into accounts outside the United States, a money laundering machine running as smoothly as oil. And when the source of those funds was compared with the organization's internal records, it matched perfectly with the unexplained shortages that had long been labeled as relationship expenses, gifts for officials, commissions for business arrangements, expenses that no one questioned, because the person approving them had the authority to approve them, the reputation to approve them, and 45 years of Costello family history behind his signature. The organization's shared funds, the sweat, and even the blood of hundreds of people during the 8 years Rafe had held power and the years before that, had been drained for 6 straight years, through the very casino every family protected, and no family truly watched. The total amount was so large that the 2 accountants did not dare read the number aloud. They simply turned the screen toward their boss, and when the money flow chart was completed, every arrow pointed toward one shadow standing in the place no one expected, because everyone saw him every day. The person with signing authority, the person representing the family in outside relationships, the person who knew the mansion's entire schedule, the person whose position allowed him to stand close to everything, and whose bloodline protected him from suspicion. But Rafe did not say that name, not even when only he and the 2 accountants remained in the room, because 15 years in this world had taught him that a name spoken one day too early was a name that could still deny everything. The ledgers proved dirty money existed, but they did not prove which hand had directly touched it. The fake names did not reveal who hired them. The shell companies were registered under lawyers' names, and someone patient enough to build this operation for 6 years was clever enough to never personally sign anything that could become evidence before the Council of Families. Just as the afternoon shadows stretched across the study windows, there was a soft knock at the door. The person standing there was not an accountant, not a soldier, but June. She stood in a simple dress, holding a folded piece of paper in her hand, and for a moment the husband and wife only looked at each other. It was the first time since the morning she had stood barefoot in that doorway, asking him not to decide that day. Between them were now countless things left unsaid, and Rafe did something he had never done in 3 years of marriage. He stood up and personally pulled out the chair beside his desk for his wife. June sat down, placed the paper on the table, unfolded it, and spoke with the calm voice of someone who had stayed awake all night to earn that calmness. "I don't have a face to give you. I don't have a name. But I have this. That night, the person standing outside the hallway when they placed me on the bed was whistling a melody. I traced it back on the piano keys and wrote it down here, every note. I don't know if it means anything, but my ears have never recorded a melody incorrectly in my entire life." Rafe picked up the sheet music, and he, a man who could not read music, intended only to look at it long enough to reassure his wife before giving it to someone who could understand it. but June quietly began singing the melody, slowly, softly enough to fill the room. The first 5 measures drifted through the silence, and by the 6th measure, the place where the melody descended at the end of the phrase like a sigh, Rafe's fingers tightened around the paper until his knuckles turned white. He knew this melody, not the way someone knows a song heard on the radio, but the way someone knows the footsteps of a member of their own family, because he had heard it countless times throughout his life, in the mansion hallways, in the backyard after meetings, an ancient lullaby from the poor countryside of Italy that his grandfather's generation carried with them on the ships crossing the ocean. A melody no radio station played, no American child knew, a song that survived only on the lips of the elderly from the old generation. And in the entire modern world of the Costello family, there was only one person left who still had the habit of whistling it whenever he was relaxed, comfortable, and satisfied. June watched her husband's expression change and understood that her piece of paper had touched something buried very deep. She asked softly, "You know who it is?" Rafe remained silent for a very long time, his eyes still fixed on the notes, before answering with a sentence that was not truly an answer, but sounded like the quiet sound of a trap being lowered into place. He said, "Knowing isn't enough, sweetheart. In my world, knowing something and speaking too soon only warns the person to run. I don't need him to run. I need him to walk in by himself, on his own feet, and speak with his own mouth, in a place where someone is listening." While the echo of that lullaby still lingered inside the mansion study, in a hidden corner of the kitchen, the young maid with the discreet eyes was pressing a phone against her ear behind the pantry door, her voice, a rushed whisper, as she reported the piece of information she had hunted for over the past 2 days, but had only dared to send now. "Sir, the lady of the house is hiding something in the vanity drawer. I saw it while cleaning the room. It's an envelope from a clinic. Inside is a pregnancy test result. She is pregnant. I'm certain. The paper clearly says so." On the other end of the line, inside the West Wing room, Garrett stood completely still for several seconds before a smile slowly spread across the face of the devoted uncle, a smile that, if the young maid had seen it, she would have understood that she had just delivered firewood to a blaze that was about to consume the very house she was standing inside. To Garrett, the past 2 days had been the first time in 6 years that his machine had ever gone off its tracks. The nephew who should have exploded on the first night had instead ordered a stand down. The old dog Mal, who should have been crushed beneath undeniable evidence, had been personally released from confinement by his young master that morning, without a single explanation given to anyone. And that news had kept Garrett awake more than everything else combined, because every hunter knew the most dangerous moment was not when the prey ran away, but when it stood still and stared back for too long. But now, fate had handed him a new card, and it was the only card of its kind in the entire deck, a weapon that required no gunpowder, left no fingerprints, and could not be broken by any investigation, because it was not an accusation. It was only a question. That night, the news began leaking outward through the exact art Garrett had perfected into a master skill. No press conference, no official statement, only whispers released in the right places like drops of oil falling onto the surface of water. One whisper during a Marchetti family dinner. One whisper through a phone call, reaching old Abruzzo's ears. One whisper inside the tavern where Doyle family loyalists gathered. And every single whisper carried the same perfect structure of poison wrapped in sugar. "I heard, Mrs. Costello has some wonderful news. Congratulations to the Costello family. It's just that, if you count the months and the timing, who really knows, after that night at the Bellamy Hotel, who the father actually is?" None of the people spreading those words made a direct accusation. That was the ultimate cruelty of it. They only asked. And questions were like fungal spores, needing no one to water them because they grew naturally inside the minds of those who heard them. Within only a few hours, Philadelphia's underground world was shaken twice as violently as it had been when the photographs first exploded that morning. Because the photographs were only about one man's honor, but this touched the most sacred thing in a world built on bloodlines, the blood of inheritance. People could forgive a crime boss whose wife betrayed him if he handled it cleanly, but no one would forgive a crime boss raising a child of uncertain blood inside his own home. The families that had already grown impatient with the stand-down order now moved like a school of fish that had smelled blood. A second wave of inquiries began arriving, and this time they were no longer wrapped in velvet. The news reached Rafe while he was standing before the money flow chart covering the entire surface of his study desk. The The person delivering it was one of the two accountants. He spoke around the subject for 3 sentences before finally daring to say it. "Sir, there are rumors outside. They're saying Mrs. Costello is pregnant, and they're asking—" He swallowed hard, unable to repeat the second half of that question in front of his employer. But he did not need to. Everyone in the room knew what the rest of the sentence was, and every eye turned toward the man standing with his back facing the desk, waiting. Because this was the kind of attack designed to have no defense. If Rafe demanded a test now, he would be publicly questioning his own wife before the entire world. If he stayed silent, he would be swallowing the question and allowing it to take root. The person who launched this attack had calculated that no matter which path Rafe chose, the poison had already entered his system. But Rafe Costello did not choose either of those paths. He stood still for the length of 2 breaths. The people in the room noticed that his shoulders did not tighten. Instead, it looked almost as if something heavy had been released from them. Then he turned around, and the only question he asked, in a voice the accountant would later say he had never heard his boss use before. Not the voice of a crime lord, but the voice of an ordinary man asking about the most precious thing in his life, was, "Is she okay?" The room fell silent. The accountant hesitated before answering, "Yes, sir. Mrs. Costello is still upstairs. She's fine." Rafe gave a small nod and continued in a voice that had returned to steel. "No one mentions this matter inside the mansion. No one asks the lady of the house a single question. Anyone who allows rumors to pass through these gates leaves through those gates permanently." Then he lowered his eyes back to the money flow chart and continued working as if what he had just heard was nothing more than a simple report that rain was coming, not a rumor about a pregnancy, not a question about the child, not even a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. And that absence, not any grand declaration or powerful speech, became the answer that spread throughout the mansion until late into the night. The news reached June through the elderly housekeeper, the only servant in the entire house who had never avoided meeting her eyes during those 2 days. She brought June her evening tea, placed the tray down, and instead of leaving, she remained standing there. In a trembling voice belonging to an old woman who could not hide her emotion, she said, "Madam, tonight downstairs they told the master about the rumors outside. That cruel story." Everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting for him to become angry. But he only asked one thing. He asked if you were okay, madam. That was all. He didn't ask anything else. June remained completely still beside the steaming tea tray, hearing those words strike deeper than any declaration of love could ever have, because she understood better than anyone what kind of corner that man had just been pushed into. His entire world was placing a poisoned question into his hands about the child growing inside her, and he had pushed it away, not through blind faith, but through a conscious choice, between doubting her to preserve the world around him and believing her while standing against that entire world. He had chosen the second path without even needing a moment to think. And the woman who had not shed a single tear during 2 days of being nailed before the entire country finally cried that night, alone beside the tea slowly growing cold. Not because she felt hurt, but because for the first time in 3 years of marriage, she knew with certainty that she was believed. The rumor about the unborn child had barely begun to settle when, close to midnight, black cars started arriving at the gray stone building behind Old Abruzzo's restaurant, the place that for 4 decades had remained the secret meeting ground of the family's council, whenever the city faced problems that could not be solved over the phone. And for this emergency gathering, everyone understood that there was only one name sitting on the agenda. Rafe arrived alone, accompanied only by a driver, because that was the rule of these meetings. No bodyguards, no weapons, only the heads of the families and the weight of their words. And when he entered the long room with the walnut table that had witnessed 3 generations of the city's grudges and betrayals, he counted every face. Old Abruzzo sat at the head of the table, with the unreadable eyes of an old turtle. The Marchetti family sent both brothers. The Doyle family arrived with their red-faced patriarch. Whether from anger or wine, no one could tell. And in the dim corner of the room, as a longtime advisor respected throughout the entire world, Garrett sat there with both hands resting on the table, wearing the sorrowful expression of an uncle forced to witness the judgment of his own nephew. No one wasted time on polite introductions. Old Abruzzo spoke first, his voice dry like old paper. "Rafe, we all respect you. For 8 years, you have managed your side of things more cleanly than even your father did. But for the past 2 days, this entire city has been laughing at us. Federal investigators are reopening old files because the press has stirred everything up. Partners from outside the state are calling to ask whether Philadelphia still has anyone holding the reins. Your honor is no longer only your own matter. It is the roof over all of us. When the roof leaks, everyone gets wet. The Doyle representative continued with the diplomacy of a hammer. Let's speak plainly. Either you handle your family matter in a way that the entire world can see, or the entire world will begin wondering what else you are still capable of handling. Rafe sat silently and listened to everything, and he recognized Garrett's hand hidden inside every sentence of that meeting. He recognized it through the way the votes had already been arranged before he entered the room, through the way the Marchetti brothers glanced toward the dim corner before every statement like students looking toward their teacher, through the way every possible escape route had already been blocked, leaving only one door open, the exact door the person behind this game wanted him to walk through, and then Garrett opened that door himself, speaking in the deep, sorrowful voice of a man forced to say the hardest thing in his life. My boy, I have argued for you for 2 days, but tonight I need to speak as an elder in this world. No one here wants blood. In these times, blood is foolishness. This entire table agrees with that principle of yours. So the council only asks one thing, something much gentler. A properly announced divorce agreement, and the lady leaves Philadelphia. She can go wherever she wants, live however comfortably you arrange for her. The only condition is that she no longer stands beside you while the world points fingers. Sacrifice the smaller matter to preserve the larger one. You lose one woman, but you keep the chair. You keep the stability of hundreds of families whose lives depend on that chair. But if you choose that woman, then this council, with regret, will have to question your position of trust. And you already know what losing that chair means. Without the chair, there is no power. Without power, what can you use to protect anyone, even her? It was a trap sharpened to perfection. Rafe could see every blade hidden inside it. Whichever choice he made, Garrett would win. Divorce meant June would be thrown out of the fortress that protected her, exactly according to the script. Refusing meant his position would begin to collapse, and another hand would catch it before it hit the ground. So he did not choose. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, looked around the table with calm gray eyes, and said only, I heard everything. Give me until the afternoon of the day after tomorrow. That afternoon, I will answer the council publicly, in front of everyone. Without waiting for approval, he nodded respectfully to old Abruzzo and left the meeting room, leaving behind a long table filled with exchanged glances, and an uncle who lowered his head to hide the flash in his eyes like a knife, because to Garrett, asking for more time was the sign of a man who had run out of moves. The wolf had already calculated everything. His nephew would use those 2 days to negotiate, to search for a way out, and finally to obediently sign the divorce papers like every practical man before him. And then the 6-year game would end exactly on the final move Garrett had designed. Rafe returned to the mansion when dawn was almost breaking, another sleepless night behind him, and from the moment he stepped through the main entrance, he felt that something was wrong. Not through his eyes, but through the instinct of a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by danger. The house was silent in a different way. Empty in a different way. He walked straight upstairs, his footsteps becoming faster along the east wing hallway, pushed open June's door, and saw a room that was painfully neat. The bed was perfectly made. The wardrobe was slightly open, with all the expensive dresses still hanging there, not one missing. Only the person was gone. Her phone was placed carefully on the vanity beside her wedding ring, turned upward like an open hand, returning something that no longer belonged to it. The vanity drawer was slightly open and completely empty. The clinic envelope had disappeared along with her. He turned and ran downstairs toward the room with the old piano, the only place in this house that truly belonged to her. The door was already open. The piano stood silently beneath the blue-gray light of the sky before sunrise. The keyboard cover had been closed carefully, like someone covering a child with a blanket before leaving. And on the glossy black wooden surface, exactly where her hands had rested every evening, there was a white envelope. Rafe lifted the envelope with both hands, like a person holding something too light to believe it could possibly carry such weight. And beneath the blue-gray light of the sky before dawn, he stood exactly where he was, beside the piano with its closed lid, and opened the letter. June's handwriting was evenly slanted and calm, the kind of calmness he had now learned to see through, because he understood that the woman who wrote lines so perfectly straight could only have done so after she had finished crying and dried her hands. The letter was not long. There was not a single accusation, Not a single complaint, not a single mention of everything she had sacrificed. It only spoke of two things, as if she feared that if she wrote any more, she would no longer have enough courage to leave. The first thing she wrote was this: I know the council called you tonight to force you to choose. I don't need anyone to tell me what they placed on the table, because 3 years of living in your world has been enough for me to understand its rules, and I cannot stand still and watch you choose between me and the chair that protects hundreds of people. I cannot watch you lose the one thing that allows you to survive in that world because of me. So I choose for you. I am leaving, not because I am guilty. You are the only person in this world I need to believe that I am innocent, and you did believe me. I knew that last night, when everyone in this house told me that among all those cruel rumors, the only thing you asked was whether I was okay. That question was the most precious thing I have ever received in 3 years of being your wife, and it is enough for me to carry for the rest of my life. Don't look for me. Let the entire city believe that you have handled your family matter. Keep your chair. Keep your life. That is the only way I can still protect you. The second thing came after that, and here the handwriting began to tremble even though she still tried to keep the lines straight. I still owe you one truth that I plan to tell you on a quiet evening after the gala night. I practiced saying it dozens of times in front of the mirror, but fate did not give me the chance. You are about to become a father. The baby is yours. Ours. I know it with the same certainty that I know my own name, and I was so happy during those days when I carried that secret alone, waiting for a perfect moment that never came. Now I am taking our child with me, not to hide the baby from you, but so our child can grow up somewhere no one forces their father to choose between his child and his own survival. If one day everything passes, if your world finally lets you go, you will know where to find us. But if that day never comes, then please keep living. Live a long life. That is the last thing I ask of you. Beneath those words there was no signature, only one small word written softly: June, like a final quiet call before a door closed. The night guards at the Costello mansion would later say that in the early morning hours they witnessed something they had never seen in 8 years, and would probably never see again in their entire lives. Their master stood motionless inside the piano room for so long that no one outside dared breathe too loudly. The letter was held in his hand, and that hand, the same hand that had signed orders capable of changing the direction of the entire city, the same hand that had shaken hands with killers without blinking, the same hand that had carried the fate of countless people on its shoulders, was trembling. Trembling clearly, trembling in a way that could not be hidden, and the thin paper made a faint sound inside that trembling, like a small bird being held too tightly. But what frightened the witnesses more than the shaking hand was what happened afterward, because they had prepared themselves for a storm, for broken furniture, for orders shouted so loudly they would tear through the darkness. What man pushed to this point would not explode? Yet Rafe Costello only folded the letter along its original creases, carefully, like folding a flag. He placed it inside the left pocket of his jacket, then walked out of the piano room with steps so steady they were almost frightening, went straight to the study, turned on the single desk lamp, sat down, and began working. No one understood it, but anyone who truly understood Rafe would have known this was the most dangerous state of that man. Other people's anger rose like fire. Rafe Costello's anger compressed itself into ice. For 3 hours before the sun fully rose, he sat alone beneath that lamp, rearranging the entire chessboard like a master player rebuilding the pieces after seeing a checkmate position. The 6-year money flow map was spread out on his left. The copied message chain controlling Beckett sat on his right. June's handwritten musical transcription of the lullaby was placed directly in the center, and he looked at those 3 things, as if they were 3 arrows waiting to be fired at the same moment. The council had given him until the afternoon of the day after tomorrow, meaning he had less than 40 hours. His enemy believed he would spend those 40 hours searching for a way to retreat, and that was the only weakness left behind by 6 years of careful planning from the old wolf. It had never prepared for a man who had nothing left to lose except a truth that needed to be spoken aloud. June believed leaving would free him from having to choose, but she was wrong about one thing. Her departure did not free him. It lit the fuse. Because now he no longer needed to protect her silently while preserving his position. Now he had only one thing left to do before the entire city. And when the first rays of sunlight on the 3rd day touched the study window, Rafe picked up the phone and made 2 calls, short, cold, and precise, like 2 opening shots. The first was to Beckett Lowe, only 1 sentence. The plan has changed. You are not acting anymore. This afternoon, you tell the truth. Prepare yourself. I guarantee your safety and what remains of your life. The second was to Mal Quinn, who answered after half a ring as if he had been sitting beside the phone waiting all night. Uncle Mal, I need you one last time. Bring your files. Call the investigation office. Find the owner of Meridian before noon. We have a press conference to build, and a wolf to invite into the cage. He didn't need to send people searching through bus stations or airports, because from the moment he folded the letter, Rafe already knew where June was. The woman had written that if one day everything passed, he would know where to find her and their child. And there was only one place in the world that sentence could point to. Not some unfamiliar city, but the place she always went whenever she needed to borrow strength to keep moving forward. And so, on the morning of the third day, the black car stopped in front of a small gray stone chapel tucked beside an old cemetery on the western outskirts, where rows of ancient maple trees were releasing red leaves across the gravel paths. Rafe told the driver to wait outside the gate, and he walked in alone. The crunch of gravel beneath his shoes was the only sound throughout the entire morning. The chapel door was slightly open. Inside, there was no one except a small figure sitting in the front row, facing a stained glass window that filtered the autumn sunlight into gentle blue and red patterns across the stone floor. A small suitcase sat neatly beside the chair. Rafe stood silently at the back of the chapel for a long moment, looking at that familiar, straight back, the back that had never bent before anything. And then he walked forward without saying a word, sat down beside his wife, leaving just enough space between them that they did not touch. And the two of them remained like that in silence for a while, before the simple stone plaque mounted on the wall beside them, engraved with the name Micah Hale and two dates separated by only 20 years. June did not turn around. She did not ask how he found her, because both of them knew the question was unnecessary. She only said quietly, with the calm voice of someone who had sat here long enough to become calm, I was going to wait until the morning was over, light one last candle for him, and then go to the station. I didn't expect you to come so quickly. Rafe looked at the plaque and spoke his first words, not as an answer, but as something he had owed her for 3 years. I've never come here with you, not once. For 3 years, you came here alone every month. I knew the schedule, I knew the road. I even knew you always bought white daisies from the shop at the end of the street. And yet I never once asked to come with you. Do you know why? June shook her head very slightly, and the most powerful man in Philadelphia sat inside an empty chapel with both hands clasped together like a student, beginning to speak the things that 8 years of power had never allowed him to say. I didn't come because I was afraid, June. Standing here in front of your brother's grave, I was afraid of admitting that I was the man who used a sister's desperation to obtain a wife. The entire city believed our marriage was a contract. You believed it too, and I let you believe that for 3 years, because the truth was much harder to say. The truth is that I saw you long before the night people brought you to meet me with that offer. I saw you playing the piano in the lobby of the Bellamy Hotel one winter evening. You didn't know I was in the crowd. I don't even know the name of the piece you played. I only know that inside that noisy lobby, no one bothered to listen, and you still played with your entire heart, as if you were performing for a hall filled with thousands. And I, the man an entire city bowed before, stood there and realized I had never done anything in my life with the kind of love you placed into those piano keys that no one was listening to. Then I learned about your brother, learned what you needed, and I did the worst thing a man could do. Instead of coming to you as a man, I came to you as a contract, because a contract cannot be refused, but I could be. For 3 years, I stayed silent not because I had nothing to say, but because I couldn't believe someone like you could stay beside someone like me for any reason other than a debt. I was afraid that if I opened my mouth and asked, I would hear the truth. So I chose not to ask. And little by little, I turned our home into a place where my wife lived like someone who owed me. Only then did June turn toward him. Her eyes were wet, but her voice did not break. She said, So for 3 years, we sat at opposite ends of the same table, guarding 2 halves of the same silence. You were afraid to ask because you thought I stayed only because of a debt, and I was afraid to speak because I believed that to you, I was only a clause. I lived in my own home like a tenant. Every night, I reminded myself not to want more, that you saved my brother and I paid with my life, and that was fair. He lies here. This plaque is the only thing that remains from that transaction. And yet, strangely enough, the baby inside me did not come from any agreement. It came from a night when both of us forgot what roles we were supposed to be playing. And maybe that is why I treasure this child more than my own life. This baby is the only proof that there was once something real between us. The autumn sunlight slowly shifted across the stone floor of the chapel, and Rafe sat silently, listening to every word without offering a single defense. Then he stood up, standing straight before his wife like a man standing before the greatest decision of his life, and spoke in the voice the entire city only heard when he gave orders that could never be taken back. But this time, that command was gentle. Listen to me, June. I didn't come here to ask you to forgive me. That is something I will spend the rest of my life asking for. I came here to bring you home. Not back to hide behind my walls. Not back to be Mrs. Costello while the world watches and judges you. Home. Not because of me, but because it is time for this entire city to hear the truth. This afternoon, at the very hotel where they nailed your name to a wall, I will bring everything into the light, and you deserve to stand there, with your head held high, not as a defendant receiving mercy, but as the only person in this entire performance who never lied even once. And the person who created all of this will have to stand before your eyes with nowhere left to hide. June looked at her husband for a long time, at the man who, for the first time in 3 years, was no longer standing behind any wall. Then she turned back toward the stone plaque, placed her hand over the name Micah Hale, as she always did whenever she said goodbye, and whispered something very softly to her brother that Rafe could not hear. He only saw her shoulders lower with relief, like someone who had finally set down a burden carried for 3 years. Then June stood up, picked up her small suitcase before her husband could reach for it, and nodded. From noon on the third day, an urgent invitation was sent from the Costello family's external affairs office to every major newspaper in Philadelphia and every national news agency stationed in the city because of the scandal. The message contained only a few words, saying that Mr. Rafe Costello, businessman, would make an important announcement regarding the events of the past 3 days at 5 o'clock that afternoon in the grand hall of the Bellamy Hotel. And those few words alone were enough to make the entire city erupt. For 8 years, that man had never stood before a single camera. The press sensed the event of the decade. The upper class passed the invitation card from hand to hand like a ticket to an execution, where no one knew who the condemned person would be. And every family on the council received a private call directly from Rafe, with exactly one sentence. I promised I would answer the council publicly. This afternoon I will answer earlier than the deadline. I invite you to come and witness it. Not a single person refused, because in their world, a man who dared schedule a public answer was either a man who had run out of options, or a man holding something that none of them had seen yet, and neither possibility allowed anyone to stay away. While the invitation was carrying out its purpose outside, inside the mansion, Rafe's machine moved smoothly and precisely, like an orchestra that had practiced until every note was perfect. In the small East Wing sitting room, Beckett Lowe sat before a cup of cold coffee, practicing the hardest words of his life in front of only one person, Mal Quinn. The silver-haired old man listened as Beckett told the story again and again from the beginning, correcting not the exact words, but the pauses between them. Mal told him, "You don't need to perform. You've performed your whole life. This afternoon is the first time you're not performing. Speak the way you spoke to the boss on that rooftop. Say everything, including the part where you sat outside that sofa with your hands shaking. People can forgive a coward who admits he was a coward. They don't forgive a coward who stays silent." Beckett nodded. His face was still pale, but his back was straight again, because he understood his own calculation better than anyone. Confessing as a victim who had been blackmailed was the only open door left. Through that door, he could receive public sympathy instead of disgust, have his $4,200,000 of debt erased as the crime boss had promised, and be protected from the hand of the person who orchestrated everything. But if he turned away from that door, sooner or later he would become another dead witness at the hands of the person who had controlled him. Between life and death, a person did not need courage to choose life. They only needed clarity. At the same time, inside the study, Mal Quinn received from Rafe the final and most important mission of his 40 years of service. The entire evidence file had been prepared into 3 identical sets, one for the press, one for the council, one sealed and ready to be sent directly to the federal prosecutors. Each set contained copies of Meridian Club's 6-year financial records, the money flow charts through shell companies, the investigation files from the private detective agency, and the copied message chain that controlled the entire gala night performance. Everything was complete except one thing, the final piece, the only thing capable of directly attaching the mastermind's hand to every document. A statement from his own mouth. And to obtain that final piece, Rafe placed his last gamble on the table of a man who was already trembling. The owner of Meridian Club was brought to the mansion through the back entrance at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. He was a wealthy man who had grown comfortable living in darkness and had never wanted to see the sunlight of the outside world. He sat across from Rafe with sweat soaking through the back of his silk shirt, and Rafe did not threaten him with a single word. He only placed 2 things on the table. On the left was the 3rd leather ledger from Meridian's real records, the same ledger the man believed was still safely locked inside his vault. On the right was a one-way business-class plane ticket to the warm southwestern region, carrying his name. Then Rafe spoke in the voice of someone discussing a business arrangement. You have 2 choices. The first choice. This afternoon, these records reach both the council and the federal prosecutors. The council will ask you why you allowed a casino protected by every family to become one family's money laundering machine. The prosecutors will ask about everything else. You know which side asks more painful questions. The second choice. You do one small thing for me within the next hour. One phone call. After that, you take this ticket. Your casino closes quietly. Your money remains yours. Your past stays in Philadelphia. The heavy man looked at the ledger. He looked at the ticket. He looked at the man offering him the chance to choose a side in a war where even the stupidest person in the city could see who was about to win. Then he lifted the phone with a hand wet from sweat, dialed the number, and when the person on the other end answered, he spoke exactly the words that had been prepared, with a frightened voice that required no acting. Sir, there's a problem. My bookkeeper disappeared this afternoon. The inner safe was opened. The only missing items are the records connected to your accounts. I don't want to say anything else over the phone. You need to come down here. The private room, as always. Just you. Before Costello's press conference. After 5 o'clock, I can't guarantee anything anymore. On the other end of the line, inside the West Wing room of the mansion, Garrett stood completely still for 10 seconds. And the old wolf, who had not made a single wrong move in 6 years, on the most important afternoon of his entire plan, made the first and only mistake of his life. Not because he became foolish, but because he became afraid. The fear of a man who was about to win but suddenly felt everything slipping away just before the finish line. Those records were 6 years of his life. They were the only noose that could ever be placed around his neck. And in his mind, every road now led to one point. He had to go there. He had to see with his own eyes what had been lost. He had to close the wound before his nephew could step into that press conference. He put on his coat, left through the back entrance, and drove himself, as he always did when going to places where he never wanted a driver. At 3 o'clock on the 3rd day, Garrett's car turned into the old industrial district beside the river. He passed through the familiar steel door, descended the familiar stairs, and entered the private room where he had negotiated countless times over 6 years. He sat down in the familiar chair across from the casino owner, who was wiping sweat from his face, and asked his first question, completely unaware that the most private room in Philadelphia that afternoon had gained additional ears, and every word he was about to speak was being recorded, cleanly and clearly, down to every breath. At 5 o'clock on the 3rd day, the 70th hour since the morning the photographs exploded, the grand hall of the Bellamy Hotel was filled in a way this place had never witnessed before. Dozens of television cameras stood like a forest in front of the wooden podium. The upper class occupied the front rows with expressions trying desperately to appear dignified, yet unable to hide the hunger of a crowd waiting for an execution. Representatives of the families on the council sat scattered throughout the room like silent stones in a flowing river. Old Abruzzo leaned on his cane in the 3rd row, and in the far right corner seat, Garrett sat with the composed expression of the steady uncle who had already returned from the industrial district by the river, quietly reassuring himself that the fire surrounding the financial records had been extinguished, that this press conference could only be his nephew's honorable surrender, a divorce announcement polished into a corporate statement, and he had prepared both a sorrowful expression and a forgiving nod for that exact moment. At exactly 5 o'clock, Rafe Costello walked out. No statement papers in his hand. No lawyers beside him. Only him, alone, wearing a dark suit. And the first thing that made the entire hall erupt like a wave crashing apart was the person walking beside him. June Costello, the woman that all of America had condemned across front pages for 3 days, walked through the forest of cameras with her hair neatly tied back and her back straight. She did not hide her face. She did not wear dark glasses. She sat down in the chair prepared beside the podium beneath the eyes of 300 people. Rafe stepped behind the podium, waited until the noise naturally died away, and began without any introduction. I'm not here to defend myself. Defending yourself is something people with guilt do. My wife has no guilt. So today, only the truth will be presented. Whether you believe it or not is your choice. But before we begin the main matter, I have one announcement. Since 9 o'clock this morning, every legal business carrying my name, the hotel chain, transportation companies, real estate companies, everything, has been transferred into a permanent trust called the Micah Hale Foundation, operating for children in this city suffering from heart conditions. The documents are signed. They cannot be reversed. I kept only one thing. He turned his head toward June for half a second, then looked back toward the wall of cameras and spoke every word slowly and clearly, like driving nails into wood. So from this moment forward, anyone who touches my wife is no longer touching my assets, my reputation, or my position. They are touching everything I have left in this world. And I will let you imagine for yourselves how a man with nothing left to lose protects the final thing that matters to him. The entire hall fell silent before a declaration no one expected. The family representatives exchanged quick glances, because they had arrived expecting to hear a surrender. Yet they had just heard a declaration of war against the very idea of negotiation. A man who had burned away his own assets could no longer be held hostage by the council. And in that shared moment of shock, Rafe stepped away from the podium and said briefly, "And now, there is someone who needs to tell you more than I do." Then, from backstage, before 300 stunned pairs of eyes and a storm of camera flashes exploding like fireworks, Beckett Lowe walked out. America's most beloved movie star stood behind the podium with an unmade face and eyes hollow from 3 sleepless nights. He placed both hands on the edge of the podium to keep them from shaking, and he confessed, completely, publicly, from beginning to end. He spoke about the card games at an underground casino 3 years earlier, the debt of more than $4 million that had been deliberately grown like livestock being fattened for slaughter, the stranger hidden in the darkness of the bar, with a phone containing everything needed to destroy him. The price demanded being one simple role, the instructions to become the face of the gala, the instructions to ask Mrs. Costello to accompany him on the piano, and as he spoke, the large screen behind him displayed the message chain in real time, every order, every exact timestamp, until the final message sent at 6 o'clock in the morning after the photographs exploded. Only 2 words. Good job. Then Beckett raised his head and looked directly into the nearest camera, his voice rough and broken. That night, I never touched that woman. They brought her into that room while she was unconscious from being drugged and locked the door from the outside. I sat on that sofa all night, shaking like a coward, because I finally understood they didn't use me to create an affair. They used my face to destroy an innocent woman in front of the entire country, and I stayed silent for 3 days. That was the most disgraceful role I have ever played. Today, I return it. The hall exploded. Reporters jumped to their feet, shouting questions over one another. The women in the front rows covered their chests in shock, and in the middle of that chaos, something happened that no script had predicted. Garrett stood up. The old wolf understood that remaining silent for even 3 more seconds meant death, so he chose to attack. He stepped into the aisle, raised one hand, and used the deep, warm voice that had soothed 3 generations of Costellos, except now it carried the anger of an elder who had been insulted. "Excuse me, everyone. I am family. I cannot stand here and watch this performance any longer." A chain of messages from an unknown phone number proves what exactly? That number is not mine. It does not belong to anyone who can be verified. And the young man standing up there? Do you know that all of his debts were just purchased by Rafe himself 3 days ago? A debtor says whatever his creditor wants him to say. This is not a confession. This is a performance bought with $4 million to clean the image of a woman. And that counterattack, it had to be admitted, was delivered with all the skill of a man who had spent 60 years mastering manipulation. It struck directly into the only weakness of all indirect evidence. For 3 seconds. Exactly 3 seconds. The entire hall shifted. The cameras turned sharply toward Rafe. Whispers rose like a swarm of disturbed bees. The family's eyes sharpened with calculation. Even some veteran reporters paused their pens, because Garrett's argument was not without logic. And within those 3 seconds, The entire city seemed to believe they had just witnessed Rafe's side lose the battle on its own stage. But the man behind the podium did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not even look at Garrett. Rafe simply gave a small nod toward someone backstage, confirming something that had arrived exactly on schedule. Then he calmly reached inside his suit jacket, pulled out a phone, and placed it on the wooden podium directly in front of the microphone. Gently, like someone placing the final chess piece onto the board. Rafe leaned down toward the phone on the podium, pressed a single button, and spoke to the entire hall in a voice so calm it was almost terrifying. This recording was made at 3 o'clock this afternoon, at a location that the people involved believed was the most secure place in Philadelphia. You don't need to believe me. You only need to listen. Then he stepped back, and inside the grand hall, where 300 people held their breath, the speakers carried every sound clearly, down to every breath. First came the panicked voice of the Meridian Club owner, explaining that the ledger had disappeared. Then a second voice spoke, deep, warm, and unhurried, the voice that everyone in the room had heard only 2 minutes earlier during the furious counterattack. Garrett's voice, a voice no one could mistake. And the entire hall listened as the old wolf, inside the room he believed was completely safe, personally removed every layer of his own disguise. Calm down. If the ledger is gone, make another ledger. For 6 years, has a single dollar ever gone missing from the money that passed through your hands? I protected you through how many storms? Now that there's trouble, I'll handle it. The important thing is that from now until 5 o'clock, not a single word gets out, especially about my accounts. Then the casino owner's trembling voice asked, what about the press conference? What about Costello's wife? What if Beckett exposes everything? And Garrett's dry laugh echoed through the speakers, a laugh that made the women in the front rows shiver. Expose what? What does he know that he can expose? I built this entire performance without leaving a single fingerprint. The maid in the mansion reported that woman's every move to me for an entire month. Even the pregnancy test in the drawer. She couldn't hide that from me. The waiter who carried the water has already disappeared 3 states away. The young movie star was nothing but a face for the newspapers to photograph. Do you think I survived 6 years walking between 2 shores because I left footprints behind? I only needed my nephew to fire once, just once, and the entire council would have handed me his chair themselves. He didn't fire, so I forced the council to strangle him with the rules of our own world. Either way, I win this game. Then, through the speakers, came the sound of a chair being pushed back, the sound of footsteps moving calmly toward the door, belonging to a man who believed he had just extinguished the final fire. And before the private room door closed, clear within the deadly silence of the grand hall, a whistle sounded, softly, calmly, a slow and old melody swaying like a cradle, a lullaby from a village across the ocean, growing quieter and quieter, with footsteps moving farther away, exactly as it had faded down the hotel hallway 3 nights earlier beside the ear of a woman who had been drugged. No one in the hall understood the full meaning of that whistle, but one person understood it completely, and 300 people witnessed the moment that every newspaper the next day would describe with the most solemn words they could find. June Costello slowly stood from her chair. No one called her forward. No script had written this part. She stood straight among the forest of cameras that instantly turned toward her, both hands relaxed at her sides, chin lifted, listening to the entire melody until the final note with her eyes wide open and unblinking. The woman who had been carried into a 3-day sentence by that very melody now stood there listening as it cleared her name before the entire country. She was proven innocent not because of a lawyer, not because of a miracle, but because of the very ears that recorded it while her mind was drowning in darkness, and the 10 fingers that found it again across piano keys in the silence of the night. And when the whistle in the recording finally disappeared, she turned her head, searching through the crowd for Garrett's face. She only looked. She did not speak, and that look achieved what no piece of evidence could. It made the old wolf standing in the aisle stumble backward 1 step, as if something had struck him directly in the chest. The rest happened quickly and cleanly, like a verdict already written and only waiting for the final seal. Rafe nodded. Mal Quinn and 2 others stepped forward and personally handed the sealed evidence files to the reporters and federal prosecutors who had already been seated in the back rows. 6 years of financial records, the shell companies, the detective reports, the message chain, the recording from that afternoon. From this moment forward, all of it belonged to the law. Rafe spoke his final words into the microphone. The Costello family does not judge people. America has courts to do that. We only deliver the truth. And before the public, not a single additional accusation was spoken. Not a single finger was pointed toward Garrett. There was no need. The entire hall had heard everything it needed to hear. And in the chaos of flashing cameras and shouted questions, people saw the representatives of Philadelphia's most powerful families slowly stand one by one, answer no one, look at no one, and quietly leave the hall through private exits, like stones being pulled away from the current of a river. And anyone paying close attention would have noticed old Abruzzo, while walking past Garrett with his cane, stop for half a second, look the man up and down with those unreadable old eyes, and then continue walking without saying a single word. What happened behind the closed doors of that world was only revealed later through brief reports. That same night, inside the long room with the walnut table, a second emergency council meeting took place without anyone needing to summon an accused person. The votes Garrett had spent 6 years carefully arranging collapsed against him in only 6 minutes. The man who violated the most sacred rule, stealing from his own brothers, and using the entire world around him as a weapon to seize power, lost every position, every protection, every door that had once opened for him throughout the city. He was handed over to the law along with every piece of evidence, and not a single family reached out to help him. In their world, that ending was heavier than any old punishment, because it meant he had never existed. And so, the most calculating man Philadelphia's underground world had ever produced was destroyed not by a bullet, not by a blade, but by 3 ledgers, a chain of messages, and a small habit of whistling that he never realized mattered, exactly according to the principle of the nephew he had raised and betrayed. Not a single drop of blood. And at the Bellamy Hotel that afternoon, the final image captured by every camera, yet impossible for any article to fully describe, was the moment prosecutors approached Garrett in the middle of the aisle, read him his rights, and escorted him toward the exit along the row where June stood. The old wolf walked past the woman he had used as a chess piece. He slowed for half a step, perhaps waiting for a slap, a curse, a victorious tear, anything that would allow him to appear as a victim in front of the cameras. But June gave him none of that. She simply stood there, back straight, eyes calm, looking at him as she would look at a stranger passing on the street. No hatred, no contempt, nothing at all. The complete emptiness of someone who had finally stepped entirely beyond his reach. And that silence, reporters later wrote, not the handcuffs, was Garrett's final sentence. Because the man who had spent his entire life planting noise inside other people's minds was finally removed from his own world by the silence of the one woman he could never buy, never intimidate, and never understand. That night, when the hands of the clock inside the Costello mansion quietly moved past the 72nd hour since the morning the entire city woke up to those photographs, June sat beside the window of the piano room, looking out at the garden swallowed by darkness. Rafe walked in, carrying no flowers, offering no beautiful words, only an old yellowed envelope worn by the passing years. He placed it into his wife's hands and said softly, "There is one final truth you need to know, so that tomorrow, when we begin again, there will be nothing left hidden in the darkness between us." June opened the envelope with fingers that suddenly felt cold. Inside were old hospital documents from 3 years earlier, Micah's surgery schedule, consultation requests, and postponement approvals signed through several layers of intermediaries that Rafe's team had spent months tracing back to the source. Everything pointed to one truth that made her heart feel as though it had stopped beating. Her brother's surgery back then could have happened 3 weeks earlier, but someone hidden in the shadows had quietly delayed it again and again, allowing his older sister's desperation to grow with each passing day, until the moment a marriage proposal was placed in front of her, and she no longer had the strength to weigh her options, only the ability to say yes quickly. And that hidden hand had been Garrett, the man who, even 3 years earlier, needed this marriage to happen quickly, needed the Costello household to have a wife whom the entire world saw as nothing more than a contract, so that one day, when he needed to create a betrayal, no one in that world would stand up and believe her. Rafe continued, his voice lowering. "I knew about this for more than a year, when I ordered a review of everything Garrett had ever touched, and I stayed silent, not because I wanted to hide it from you, but because telling you back then would have been no different from taking credit on top of the greatest pain of your life. It would have meant telling you that you married me because you were deceived. I wasn't brave enough to watch you hear that, when between us there still wasn't even one honest conversation. Now you know everything. You once believed you sold your life to save your brother, and still failed to save him. The truth is, you never lost a bargain. Someone stole your right to choose. And if tonight you want to take your suitcase and walk through that door to live a free life, I will open that door for you and take care of you and our child for the rest of our lives. But if you stay, then stay as a woman who freely chooses, not as someone who owes a debt. June looked at the yellowed papers in her hands, looking back at 3 years of marriage under a completely different light. The silent dinners, the distance she thought was coldness, turned out to be two people who had both been arranged by the same hidden hand and both afraid to believe they deserved to be loved. Then she placed the envelope down, stood up, walked toward her husband, and for the first time in 3 years, she was the one who reached out and held the hand of the man the entire city feared. She said, "I'm staying. Not because of a debt, not because of our child, but because tonight, for the first time, I am free to choose. And I choose you." 1 year later, on an autumn morning when the rows of maple trees in Philadelphia once again began to burn with color, the Micah Hale Foundation cut the ribbon on its first project, a bright music room filled with sunlight inside the city's children's hospital, where young heart patients recovering after surgery had a place to laugh, to sing, and to forget the smell of medicine. At the center of that room stood a piano brought from the Costello mansion, the old piano that had traveled through this entire story. That day, surrounding the piano were the glowing faces of children dressed in new clothes, their laughter clear and bright throughout the room. They crowded around, placing their tiny fingers on the white keys, and June, wearing a simple dress with her arms slightly fuller, because their baby girl, nearly 4 months old, had just been taken by the old housekeeper into the next room so her mother could work, sat down beside the piano and patiently taught each child how to play the first notes of their lives. The children's clumsy, broken melodies blended with their laughter, making the entire room feel bright once again. And in the front row, among doctors and donors, Rafe Costello sat listening with his eyes never leaving his wife, the man who had spent his entire life standing in the shadows and watching the world now sitting in the daylight, openly and peacefully, like any other happy husband and father, because he had finally understood something that 8 years of power could never teach him, but 72 hours of storms had taught him completely, that true strength does not come from making others fear you, but from daring to trust someone exactly when the entire world tells you to doubt them. That honor is never cleansed with blood. Honor can only be cleansed with truth, and that in this world, every empire will eventually change hands, every power will eventually fade, but trust given to the right person at the right moment is the one asset that continues creating value forever, because it creates something no amount of money can ever buy, a home where people are allowed to be themselves. Dear friends, the story of Rafe and June comes to an end here, but its echo, about trust, about truth, and about the value of a person who dares to stand still in the middle of a storm, is something we hope to leave inside your hearts. If this story touched you, please press like and share the video to support our channel. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the meaningful stories we bring to you every day. And we truly want to know what you thought about this story. Which moment touched you the most? Please share your feelings from the deepest part of your heart in the comments below, because every word you leave behind is the greatest encouragement that helps us continue telling meaningful stories. Thank you sincerely for staying with us until the final moments of this video. We wish you and your family lasting health, a joyful life, peace, and happiness every single day. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.